Good evening, everyone. It's really, really an honor and a privilege to be together this evening. And it's an honor to welcome you, Julian, to 9to NY and to the Bronfman Center of Programming. It's also an auspicious evening because it comes at the Shilhei, at the end of Yom HaShoah, Israel's Holocaust Commemoration Day. And here and around New York City and around the world, there were commemorations of the 6 million that were lost in the Shoah, in the Holocaust. And so it's particularly poignant to be sitting here together with you. And I wanted to add a coda, a little footnote, even before we begin. And those who haven't read the book, and hopefully you will, I remember reading the book, and in the very early pages of the book, there's a date that stood out, a date that was significant to you and your family. And that date was a Hebrew date that was placed in a prayer book of your step-grandmother, a great woman, one of the great characters in your book. And the date was the 27th day of the month of Nisan. And just kind of randomly looking at my calendar today, I noticed that this evening, Thursday evening into tomorrow, is in fact the 27th day of the month of Nisan. And so both personally and more powerfully as part of the collective, we're here tonight on a very important moment. And so with that, I just also wanted to say that we have people in the audience tonight who have come specifically because they're honoring the memory of loved ones and those who are in some way affected, as all of us are, but in a very immediate way by the Holocaust. And so we honor those memories and those people who are here, honoring those people. And so there are also other people who are here, and so you'll let us know as we begin. This is a really, this is an intensely powerful journey that you have brought into the world. You have, the book begins with your discovery at a very young age. Well, it begins actually, I should say differently, it begins with the tragedy of your father, the end of your father's life. But it also tells a story of recovery. It tells a story of a deep search that you went on in order to really find your father and to find others who were part of this remarkable attempt to save children from imminent demise and imminent destruction. And so I just wanted to, the first question to you, just as I'm welcoming you here, is can you bring yourself here into this room? You said there's some people here that you wanted to mention. Bring us here before we start on the journey that you'll take us on.
Well, thank you very much. It is a great honor to be here, and everyone's been telling me for the last couple of days when I've said that I'd be appearing here, how lucky I was to be coming to this storied venue, and I'm grateful to be here. Yes, I mean, here this evening, there are two other sons of some of the children in the book that I talk about, as Tom Ruderman, who is the son of the last of them that is still living, and thank God she's still alive today, and was one of the high points of doing the research to find her and to talk to her, someone who walked the same streets as my father, and also Ron Schon, who is the son of Alice Hess, who also plays an important part in this. So we've been meeting in the last few days and talking about our common heritage, sort of honorary cousins brought together by this one odd quirk that we have in common.
So introduce us to the title of the book, of course, is actually taken from the advert or the advertisement that was placed in what it was then called the Manchester Guardian, now the Guardian. Can you take us into who your father Robert was and how the book begins and what could have launched you into the trajectory of trying to find Bobby, finding the early Robert?
Yeah, I mean this whole story in a way, my involvement in it begins in December 2020, and I went to a Whole Foods market in Northern Virginia, do my shopping, and I was putting the shopping in the back, and then just checked my phone as well, journalists do to see if we're being looked for, if we're needed. And there was this email from the archivist at The Guardian saying, "Is this your family?" And attached, there was an attachment, and I don't know if we can stick it up on the screen, the attachment he sent, which was the adverts. This is pretty much what appeared as the attachment to the email, and I could see very quickly that the second one was about my father, because I recognized the address. I knew that was our last address, the family's last address in Vienna, and it was hard to describe how that felt, because it was all so long ago. My father was dead almost 40 years, and even when he was alive, we didn't talk about this. And this is my grandfather, who I had known, pleading for the life of my father when he was 11 years old, trying to, in a language he didn't understand, trying to reach out to people he had never met in a foreign land in the hope of saving him. So it was really that gave me the jolt to start looking at a history, a family history that had been really long buried.
So I want to go there, because it had been long buried, and so something about this excavated it, brought it up to the surface. But you had pretty much put it below the surface for 40 years. Your father, when you were a very young man, you begin the book telling us that you remember the day that you were coming back from the dentist, thinking that life was full and life was beautiful, and you came home to discover that your father, who had been missing for some time, and it wasn't the first time that he had gone missing, that he had taken his own life. And just, can you walk us through what it was like, of course, obviously, the shock of all of that and in the ensuing days, but that it didn't prompt you to go and discover who your father was and what might have led him to where he had taken his own life?
Yes, it was my job after my father died to ring around people that he had known. And one of the people that I had to call was his foster mother, who'd raised him since when he arrived as a refugee, aged 11, in Wales, to give her a call and to tell her what had happened. And
just for those who are here, the foster mother was the foster mother of your father, even as his parents, as your grandparents, also had been able to escape, but they weren't allowed for visa reasons. They weren't allowed to actually parent their own child once in England. But this woman, who was the foster mother, you ringed her up, yeah.
Yeah, she had raised him from when he arrived at 11 to when he went off to university. She was an extraordinary woman, and her husband, who died very early, also hothoused my father. And by the time as he was 16, not only did he speak English, but he was so advanced in school that he was sent to university at the age of 16. So it was her that I had to call and to break the news of what had happened. And her immediate reaction was, as he was the Nazis' last victim, that they had got to him in the end, which made no sense to me whatsoever. I mean, we lived in a very prosperous area of West London, a very peaceful life. The past, the Holocaust, his childhood in Vienna did not feature in our lives. So, and it bemused me, but I sort of left it on a shelf and went on with life, and just didn't know what to make of it. And it's only when this advert came that I began to look back and research what had happened in Vienna in my dad's childhood, and also found out in the process that in his last days, after he'd left our house, he had gone to find Nance, his foster mother, and the tragedy is she hadn't been at home. She was always at home, but not this weekend. She'd gone to Wales, and he sat outside the house for a while before going off and was never seen alive again. And so when I called her a few days later to say what had happened, she realized that he had tried, in his last acts to sort of make contact with someone who had known him, the only person alive who'd known him as this 11-year-old Bobby, a foreigner, a refugee, something that he had tried most of his life to hide and to bury.
So he himself tried to bury all of that. And for you and for the survivors, you're left at this moment, Nan says to you that he's the last victim. Hitler, in the end, did get to him. Right? That's what she said. Hitler got to him in the end. He's the last victim. And for your family, though, the narrative didn't extend beyond, right, the story of your father, the narrative about what might have been, right, his particular psychology, what was going on for him, why he was upset, or what was, troubling to him. And then you yourself, he tried to bury the earlier parts of himself, and then you also buried it. Yeah. As soon as that came up, you kind of went on with life, and there, it was a curiosity or whatever it was, and you just went on with your life and until the moment in Virginia at the Whole Foods.
Yes, I carried around with me. I was always interested in the family history, but he would not talk about it. My grandfather wouldn't talk about it. When my grandfather died, I inherited this shoebox full of bits and pieces, like the medal that my grandfather had got for fighting in the First World War for the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a scrap of paper saying this man fought in the First World War, basically don't trash his shop, Heil Hitler, signed by the local Gauleiter. I knew these were significant, but I didn't know the story that they told. They were sort of dots that I had failed to join, and only really set about trying to do that when these adverts surfaced.
And so these adverts, they surface, and you begin to pull on the thread. You begin to unravel and piece it together. And your life as a journalist and as someone who's kind of your job, you begin to apply the tricks of the trade to your own story, your own familial story. So was it driven by, what drove you? Was it curiosity? Was it a need to know who that 11-year-old Bobby was? There's parts of, there's so many poignant moments. I cried throughout the book. One particular poignant part of the book, you describe actually discovering what it was like, what he had been like, what your father had been like when he just came over, right? The stories of they had to remove tea kettles because he would be scared of the whistle because it would signal to him, right, that there could be a group, there would be an arrest. Yeah. He didn't want to go into the police station because he said nobody comes out of the police station. This terrified 11-year-old child, and you, of course, by the way, in your own biography, having an only child, just as he had been an only child to your grandparents. All of these things are moving. What is driving you? Is it to get to know your father, to uncover the mystery, that only if the secrets come out will things be healed? And also, what leads you to be as curious about the other children as you were about your own father?
I think that was the main motivation, is after I saw his advert, I saw, obviously he wasn't alone. There were other families there, and the top one is a fervent prayer in great distress. Obviously, there was huge amount of drama underlying each of these adverts. And I went to the archives and looked through from summer 38. They really began to appear, adverts for children in summer 38, and they carried on most in the fall of 38, but they carried on and really until the summer of 39. And in that time, there were about 80 children advertised. So it just seemed obvious to me, as a journalist, of course you've got to find out what happened to the 80. You've got to find out, there are 80 children whose parents have, tried to think of the best adjectives they can to try and save them. So did they save them? Did they survive? And so that was to tell the story of all those 80. That was a prime motivation. And then the price I had sort of paid in order to tell those stories is obviously I had to tell the truth, or as much of the truth as I could find about my own family's history, which is something that had been buried because it was suicide and because it wasn't talked about. A whole buried history, and so as really a prize to be able to write these other stories, which were incredible stories of survival. Some of the children.
Can you tell us, especially maybe we can begin with George. Do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there are three I would talk about briefly, because the real stroke of luck underlying this book is that among the 80, there were a half dozen who left behind them really full accounts of what had happened to them, either in memoirs that had been written for their own family, or one had been published in Dutch, another had given a really extensive interview to a documentary, and there was a full interview which was still left on tape, and then Liz Ruderman, who was still alive. And so the real stroke of luck underlying and drove me to write the book is they had such different lives, that their escapes, their stories of survival were so very different. So with George Mandler, who grew up just a couple of blocks from my dad, a bit older, he ended up in the U.S. Army. He went to America.
Is he one of these adverts? Or
no,
he wasn't.
He's not in these. He's on another
in another
day.
group, right?
He joins the U.S. Army, and then he's sent to Camp Ritchie, which was set up to train Jewish refugees from Central Europe to be intelligence officers. And they were known as the Ritchie Boys, sent over to do interrogations and cross-examinations of Nazi officers that were captured on the battlefield. Henry Kissinger was a Ritchie boy, and George Mandler and two of his friends were Ritchie boys, and they end up at the last days of the war driving around in a jeep around the wreckage of defeated Germany, hunting down the remnants of the SS, who people believed that were going to be a stay-behind force to harry the occupying powers. And they come across a cabin in the woods, and there had been SS officers there, and they'd fled and left behind this hoard of Nazi cash, Reichsmarks. And so the three of them decided to do a bit of auto-restitution right there and then, and that was a kind of starting money when they went back to the US. And then there's another child in the adverts was Gertrude Langer, who is up there.
Right. Before we move to Gertrude Langer, can you say a bit more about George?
Yeah.
Because I was very taken by George, and you also, it seemed, were very taken by George also, because not only do you describe George's story, but also George and Bobby are in exile together. There's a lot of comparing, because George, of course, becomes a psychologist, like your father. Your father, your father, Robert Bobby, was a psychologist, and in many ways, you compare the two of them in ways that, right, you put them side by side, and the different ways they experienced, perhaps, or the varying ways in which they processed. Right, your father, who didn't speak at all about his experience, and you discovered after, by the way, one of the best parts of the book is your detective work, and the detective work that led you to George led you also to discover that he had written an entire book about his experience, and where your father was silent and didn't remember details about what it was like, right, in Vienna, or didn't discuss the details, or even the emotions, more importantly. George had done all of that in some way. And so just a little bit more about, like...
Sure. Yeah, no, George Mandler was incredible. And in fact, since the book was published, his son, one of his sons, Peter Mandler, who's a historian, sent me an email, and he'd found some psychology conference, I think in the north of England, and a seminar and a little panel in which both my father and his father had been on. So leaving us to wonder, did they talk? Did they talk about their common heritage? It's an unknown. But yet, George Mandler was open and reflective and self-critical in a way that was the absolute opposite from my father. So in a way, reading that, he questioned himself. What did he consider himself, for example? Did he consider himself a Holocaust survivor? And he had a debate with his sister who thought they were, and he said, no, we haven't been in the camps.
We don't have
we're
the
not
numbers.
survivors. We didn't have a number. And in a way, because he was sort of, he was a left-of-center psychologist from the same district as my father, he came to sort of stand in for all the things that I'd failed, hadn't had the chance to ask my father about how things felt, what it was like. I knew the bare facts of my father, but I didn't know how it happened and what it felt like. And he, in many ways, helped me understand my father better because he was someone so similar and yet so open, where my father had been very much a closed book.
It's also interesting, and I want you to come back to Gertrude. I interrupted you, but it's interesting because there's a premise in the book that I think is alive in this conversation, which is, to the extent that we can imagine processing a trauma like the Shoah or the surviving or whatever that might be, there is something about holding secrets, and what Nance, had said, what the foster mother for your father had said, that Hitler, right, there was a victory here, and that your father had suffered that, and that there's the question, which is, had he been more, had he had a way to express it or a way to talk about it in some way, would he have been a bit more, right? Would he have lived longer? Would he have been there for you longer? And what's really powerful in the book is that George, of all of the people in the book, is the earliest one to return to Vienna is George, the one who was able to talk about the earlier experiences in some way and process it. So maybe bring us now to Gertrude and her story.
So Gertrude got out through the adverts and went to Britain, but her parents couldn't follow her. It became harder and harder to go west. But there was a last resort. There was a Chinese consul in Vienna who was writing out visas against the orders of his superiors who were based in Berlin and back in China. But he wrote out all the thousands of visas, and so they ended up in Shanghai. And they arranged for Gertrude to take a ship from Liverpool and sail across in 1940, sail around the world to Shanghai, and the ship left Liverpool while it was in the middle of a bombing raid, all lights off, or all the kids in life vests zigzagging their way out. And she, this documentary in which she gives an extended interview, she describes this trip, and she describes Shanghai, which was an extraordinary Jewish city because it had been built basically by two Jewish families from Baghdad who'd come with the British Empire and made, really built Shanghai, the Sassoons and the Kaduris. And so when Jews arrived, it was a bit of, it's a little bit of a Vienna on the Huangpu. It was an Oriental Vienna, and she had for 1 year, 1.5 years, this wonderful time as working for a dressmaker. But then, of course, Pearl Harbor happens. The Japanese march into the international settlement, take over, and they're not sure what to do with the Jews because, on one hand, the Jews funded their war against Russia in 1905. On the other hand, they were full of conspiracy theories, and they're full of the protocols of the elders of Zion. So they put them all in one place, which becomes a ghetto. And then the Axis happens, and the SS turned up. And so these Jews have arrived in Shanghai, the other side of the world, thinking they've escaped the Germans. And then you have SS officers marching through the ghetto. And their suggestion to the Japanese is, this is the way to deal with your problem, but all the Jews on a boat, send it out to sea and then torpedo it. And that was a step too far for the Japanese, and they kept them in the ghetto. But Gertrude, in her interview, gives this fantastic account of life in the ghetto and what they had to do to survive. And it's an episode of the Jewish experience of the Holocaust that I was completely ignorant of. So I was just so lucky to come across it, this witness testimony, and that it was one of the children in the adverts.
It's an amazing part of the book, a whole chapter on that. Can you also include, I think you said someone else that you wanted
Yes, I mean, the other one that I always think of is Fred Schwarz,
okay.
who didn't make it as far as Britain. It was him and his brother, Fritz, was stuck in the Netherlands when the Nazis arrived in 1940. They're put into a transit camp in Westerbork, and then they try and hang on in Westerbork, but eventually they're transported to Theresienstadt. They try and hang on there using all their ingenuity to try and avoid being transported. But eventually they're transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau. But survive that because they're put on, in the last days, they're put on a work detail that sends them to a satellite labor camp of Buchenwald and end up in that narrow strip of land between the advancing Red Army and the US forces. It's getting narrower and narrower, and everyone is dashing, scrambling to get west, to get to the US forces. There's inmates and their former guards who've stripped off all their uniforms and are racing and hoping to mix in with the crowd and get to the other side. And he describes it. It's in a book that was published in Netherlands in Dutch, and I was so lucky. One of the last people I found was his son, and I'd almost given up when I asked a friend at the Hague Tribunal, who are good at finding people, and he helped me out. And we found someone who said, "Oh yeah, I played tennis with him," and so I got in touch with the son, and he said, "Yes, he wrote this whole book," and it was one of the most extraordinary accounts of survival. It's up there for me, with Primo Levi, but in Dutch. But luckily, there was an unpublished English translation. So another stroke of luck that tells the story of what would have happened to these children if they had not been fostered, if they hadn't been responses to those adverts.
Each one of these stories is just, you could spend forever on them. Can you just maybe the last persona that we'll touch, before I have a number of other questions to ask you about this, and then open it up to all of you. I'm sure you have your questions. And the Liz and that person or that story. We said that we wanted to touch that, or you had said you wanted to mention that. And is there something in particular that you wanted to share?
I mean, she just sort of, for me, to be able to talk to someone who'd walked those same streets, who'd been,
she was actually there.
Been there and was pretty much, I think, exactly the same age as my father, and she just had such an extraordinary, spirit. You could see how she had survived, and such a clear mind and such sharp recall. I just kept. I was listening actually to the recording earlier today because they wanted to use it on NPR, and I keep on laughing in the interview because I'm just so joyful to be able to hear someone speaking from firsthand, because I'd given up. I'd given up on the hope that I would find anyone alive, and it was really towards the end that I found her.
So part of the discovery, part of this book is also not just recovering and discovering your father and the stories of the past, but how the stories of the past are animating us, whether we like it or not. Right? That's part of the assertion I think the book makes, is that when when that email comes to you and you're in Whole Foods, something in you that you knew but didn't acknowledge was awakened. And even there are parts of the book where your own journey is mapping, weirdly or unconsciously onto some of, you're working for The Guardian. These advertisements are in the prior iteration of The Guardian, Manchester Guardian. You're doing the work, so in some sense the past, as you quote, is not the past. It's still here with us. Were there things, looking back now, are you, how has knowing these things changed you? How has knowing these things changed your family?
Right.
How has knowing these things changed your now 19-year-old son? Are there things that you are still, maybe it isn't over, obviously it's not over, but where has it brought you, knowing now what was secret then?
There's a lot of research done now on epigenetics, how the trauma of one generation is handed over to the other. And it feels kind of right to me in that even long before I came across this, that I was aware that there was something, that there was things unsaid. I had to do the oration at my step-grandmother's Valley's funeral and couldn't hardly get through it, and I couldn't understand why. It was so traumatic.
Your body seized up.
Yeah, because I grew up in Chiswick, which is a kind of prosperous, very leafy, very safe part of London. Where did this come from? And what I found out is that we'd grown up being told that, thank goodness, our family has survived. But in fact, the truth was that we just stopped talking about the people who'd been killed. So they didn't register in our lives. And so, my grandmother's sister and father was killed. Valley's husband and mother were killed. My great aunt's son, my father's cousin, who really, when I looked through the pictures, was like his brother. He was like, they grew up as an elder brother. He worked within a Austrian cell within the French resistance, was unmasked because of a stupid mistake by someone else in the network. The Gestapo came for him, and he died under torture in Vienna. And he was never talked about. His picture didn't hang on our wall. He wasn't part of our lives. And so, that is sort of the blessing of having done this book, to bring these people back to life and remember them. And me and my sister and brother and one of my nieces, we went to the Central Friedhof, the Central Cemetery in Vienna, and we were able to put a stone on this boy's grave, Motti's grave, and it was clear that the attempt to bury the past had not worked, that it still felt it was pushing itself up from the surface. And so it's just really a stroke of luck that led me to be able to write this book and give these people their due.
At risk of being, you're British, and so I apologize if I'm asking too many questions about emotions. But I mean, did you feel at any point, Julian, that you met your father, you met the child? Were there any moments during this journey where a part of you as a young man that didn't understand or maybe even resented elements of who your father had become softened? You felt that you could appreciate how difficult it might have been for him to have left as an 11-year-old and to be so scared to be all alone. And what was that like for you?
Yes, because when came across this advert, he was just long gone, and I'd only known him as this quite austere father, just focused on academic work, doing our homework, and I think much of his life was to blot out that he'd come. Robert had been Bobby before and been an 11-year-old who was scared out of his wits, who was a stranger in this country and in the UK. And so knowing, of course, knowing that boy and being aware that he was the boy before the man made it easier to think about, about the decision he took to leave us, and aware that there'd been a lot, going on that he tried to suppress.
From the very personal to a little bit broader, I just wanted a couple of quotes in here that you put into the book that really speak to this moment, and I wondered about them as I read them. You spoke about, you go into such detail that is so rich about the world of Vienna, right, and the history of the Jews in Vienna, which of course could also have been the history of the Jews in many, many, many places, in many ways. And in one particular part of the story, you write this: there is still a stone plaque above the church entrance, noting in Latin that it had been built on the site of a synagogue, of a synagoga perversa. This is when Leopold, right? And when it come in and issued an edict, an anti-Semitic edict, and had built essentially, again, this church above a synagogue and called it synagoga perversa. Although what seems particularly perverse, you write, is that a few centuries later, many assimilationist Jewish families would call their children Leopold, or in our own grandpa's case, Leo. Such was the yearning to belong. Can you speak to this yearning that Jews seem to have to belong, which is a kind of forgetting of who we are, right? It's kind of the burying of the past analog, kind of assimilationist, right? On the one hand, we can understand Jews who always felt insecure that they might be, right? The fawning reflex, that post-traumatic, stress, right? One way is to kind of to fawn, and in some way to appease or to assimilate. Did you discover that also, that part of this discovery of the stories was also your own desire to own Jewish identity in a particular way? Did it change the way you thought about your own Jewish identity and the way others, respond? The perversion, right, to name yourself Leopold.
Right. That's kind of crazy.
It is kind of crazy.
Yes, I mean, I think, there's a long history of assimilation among Vienna Jews. There's the most assimilationist community, I think, out there. And it always amuses me that when Herzl wanted to hold the first Zionist Congress, he couldn't do it in Vienna because of no kosher restaurants. They had to go to Basel, where at least they could get food. And you have to go several generations back to in my family until someone has a Jewish name. My great grandfather was called Mandler, but after that they were all Christian names. So there's this desire.
And your father's name was Moshe Shmuel, was it?
No, my grandfather's Bris name is Lev Shmuel.
Lev Shmuel.
Yeah, but Leo, and I never knew that until, of course, starting to dig. And I found in the records, in the rabbinical records, that he had formally left the faith in 1927, just before my father was born, but then rejoined in 1933, a few months after the Nazis had taken over in Berlin. Now, I don't know what informed that, but there was the Austrian composer Arthur Schoenberg, who actually did the same thing. He converted back in 1933, and the reason he gave is to realize that giving up the faith wouldn't make any difference. They see us as a race, so why give it up? And possibly that's how my grandfather felt, that to sort of turn around and own his own identity. But
is that a message that, given when this book is coming out and where we are at this moment, in the aftermath of the last 2 years in the world and what we've seen, I mean, I'm putting you on the spot. I'm asking you this question. You can, maybe your book is just let people take their own conclusions. But do you think that there's that message that Jewish identity, the loss of Jewish identity, or running away from Jewish identity in any way, shape, or form will ultimately, right? It won't. It's kind of twofold. Like, on the one hand, it won't matter ultimately in terms of anti-Semitism, but it also is a part of you that you are denying or burying. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be an imposter to start talking about that, in that I'm not Jewish. My mother is not Jewish. She's from Manchester, but what it made me realize is that we had this history. We were from part of us was somewhere else. All this has happened, and we were pretending like it had never happened. And so it really was, for me, not a question of sort of reclaiming Jewish identity, but just saying, this is a story. Right. This is what happened.
Right.
And, take it as we may. It's better to know than not to know.
Well, I have news for you. Had you been alive when your grandfather and your father were alive, you would have also been.
Yes.
Right. So you're with us. You're with us. You are, and you are, and we're going to open it up in a moment. Just last thing, and that I'm so curious about. One of the other very powerful pieces of the story is kind of the inevitability of or seemingly the inevitability of Jewish history leading kind of what you quoted someone calling the unrequited love affair, that Jews will be in an unrequited love affair with cities and with cultures that they belong to, Vienna being one of the longest you wrote. But the sense of, that some of us, the resurgence of anti-Semitism at this moment and its proliferation and its, the different forms that it takes. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs once called it a virus that has intelligence. It always takes on different forms, but it survives nonetheless. We never know exactly how to eradicate anti-Semitism. And at this moment, with the expansion and the proliferation and the increase of anti-Semitism, some look at it as an inevitability. But one of the tensions, of course, in your text is, of course, the dependency. Your grandfather, throwing yourselves at, will anybody take in our intelligent? We're seeking a kind person. And there are clearly kind people in the world that aren't the Jews. Kind people in the world who care about the plight of the Jewish people, who care about the plight of children just like your father. So that's there's kind of a question, which is, with this kind of hatred in the world, how does one maintain a hope in finding kind people? We seek kind people. Is that a part of what is the upshot for you? There are kind people, yeah? There are incredible people everywhere.
Yes, and just as conflict and persecution and atrocities leave reverberations that go through generations, so do these acts of kindness, which in conditions like 1930s Vienna and today in our country and yours, acts of kindness become acts of resistance against the prevailing norm. I think there are 30 people alive today who wouldn't have been alive without Nance Bingley, the woman who took my father. So, one of the lessons is that those acts are powerful, and they reverberate through the generations just as trauma does, and but pushing against it. The other one thing I would say that comes to mind, and I think I do not have a complete memory, I think it's my father who said it, is that the Jews came out of the Holocaust, or the victims came out of the Holocaust with one of two conclusions: either that this should never happen to the Jews again, or this should never happen to people again. And he divided people, according to what consequence or what conclusion they had drawn. I think that is it's clear that a lot of people, the people that are in power now in Israel have taken the first conclusion.
Not necessarily, but yes, maybe. There's certainly some people in Israel and certainly who have that, and there are many, many who don't.
Yes, I'm talking about
I know.
People in
some of the people,
government.
right? Some of the people, not all of them, but certainly one can become even more entrenched in ethnocentrism and forget about world-centric embrace
and humanity.
And humanity, for sure. It's really a powerful. I'm sure it's not lost on you that this book is right now in the New York Times and NPR is coming out at a time when there is such terror around the world with the rise of various ethno-nationalisms and so on. And so this is really a clear, stories of the absolute, horrific ends to which any of the othering, right? When others, whether it's Jews or others, right? The dehumanizing of people can lead to horrific places. And you also tell a story of great kindness and the sublime within the human being. So with that for a moment, I'm sure there are people here who have some questions that they would like to ask. And so if you can, I'll leave it to you if you want to call, we can call on people. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. I'm going to repeat the questions. It'll make it easier than having to take the microphone around. So if you could speak up. Yeah.
I haven't read your book. I didn't know you wrote a book, but I've been looking at these adverts. They're a very fascinating part of history. I'm wondering if you ever spoke to your stepmother about what attracted her to particularly as you just mentioned that he sort of disowned his own Jewishness and raised you not Jewish. Was he more drawn to his stepmother who was not Jewish?
So let me repeat the question. So the first question was, what drew? I mean, both essentially the question is about the stepmother, Nance, or the foster mother. What drew her to this particular advertisement, right? In particular, of all of them, A, and B, given that your father, Robert, grew up with, right, both his biological mother and his foster mother. What was the relationship, to each of them, or really back to his mother, and how did it factor in potentially raising you with either a strong or a weak Jewish identity, and so on? So, yeah.
Remind me, the first bit was. Oh yes, I know. Yes, so I mean, Nance Bingley, the woman who'd taken in my father, was long dead by the time I arrived there. So I never got the chance to say what was it. But talking to people who knew the Bingleys in Carnarvon, which is a Welsh town, I went back there and they were just extraordinary people. They were Fabian socialist Guardian readers who actually lived their values, and they were just, from the word go, when the Nazis took over, just focused on trying to help in any other way, and any way they could. And they'd taken in a woman to stay who'd been a German refugee before that. They were just looking for a way to make a difference, to try and do something in the face of this terrible evil that's sweeping across Europe. They wanted to make a personal difference. And thank God my grandfather acted fast, because they just responded to the first advert that they saw, and he was one of the early ones. I mean, my father was incredibly fond of Nance. She'd, taken him in and taken him in his teenage years. His relationship with his mother, his biological mother, was more complicated. Obviously, he raised him from birth and early years, but she really embarrassed him, because she was so obviously a foreigner. She was so obviously, uneducated, that he kind of hid her away. And often when she would come round to our house and, start, hammering out the veal to make schnitzel and, and taking over the kitchen, he would hide upstairs in his study.
This is Omi?
This is Omi, yeah.
This is Omi.
Yeah. So it was complicated. But as far as Jewish identity, my family had, over generations, distanced themselves from that, and so that wasn't a dividing line. He was distancing himself from foreignness.
Your question is such a great question, and it just touched me so much because it highlights, right? Your father, like, of all of the advertisements, it's a very unique. It's the most unique of all of them, because he essentially said, "I'm seeking somebody who's kind," and the reader thinks, "Oh, do I qualify?" And and by the way, your question also, it's profound on a number of levels, because in the biblical story of the savior of the Jewish people, Moses, of course, there was a genocidal decree from Pharaoh, and everybody has to protect their male children. And the story actually is of the mother of Moses, who's not named. We know her from the tradition as a woman named Yocheved. She places Moses into a reed basket, and she puts him, of all places, on the Nile, which is not really, on some level, not the smartest idea, but maybe it is. And of course, in the biblical story chapter, in very early chapters of the book of Exodus, the daughter of Pharaoh, of course, winds up finding the baby and raising the child, but the birth mother is not far away. And so it actually lends itself to this conversation about the proximity of the birth mother, and it's really just to think about it, and your father, just to think about Leo and how he crafted that ad. How could he have known? But like, that saved you, and you wouldn't be here without those words. So that's a pretty awesome thing to think. It's mind blowing. Okay, questions? Yes. Were these ads placed in other newspapers and in other countries? And why The Guardian? It's interesting. Why The Guardian? Why England? Yeah.
Yes, they were in the Jewish Chronicle and the Telegraph. I mean, I've focused on most immediately, so the reason they came to be is because the Jewish community in Vienna, the IKG, decided they were going to help with getting Jews out because they thought that would minimize harm. So they set up a kind of one-stop shop. If you want to get out, come in and we'll sit down with you and we'll counsel you. And one of the pieces of advice is you could put an advert in a British paper. Because if you had a sponsorship, someone saying we'll pay for tuition and for board, then you could get papers to leave, and you can at least get your kids out. So that is why almost all of the adverts in the Manchester Guardian are from Vienna, because of that. And Manchester Guardian, because there was a relationship between the Manchester Jews and Vienna Jews because of textile trade, the rag trade, and also because the Manchester Guardian at the time had a Hungarian Jew who was the correspondent, a guy called Marcel, but it's known as Mike Fodor. And he was like the doyen of the press pack there. And he wrote far more about the plight of the Jews in Vienna and in Central Europe than the other papers. So they looked on the Manchester Guardian as a sympathetic place to place an advert.
Just to underscore the unconscious piece here, because as soon as you mentioned Mike Fodor, there's a point in the book where you're wondering about your connection to him, because it turns out that you're in many ways.
I did the same job.
You had the exact same job as Mike Fodor.
Yeah, he was a Central Europe correspondent, and I was a Central Europe correspondent. And yes, at a time, and he had kind of found out he'd sort of held court in the Louvre Cafe in Vienna, and all these great writers would sort of sit around, and he would say what's going on, and then go on from Sinclair Lewis and a whole bunch of American and European correspondents, and it was amazing to read. The person who'd done the job before me and the role he had played, and he ends up having to do a runner from Vienna. After the Anschluss, the U.S. consul drove him to the border at night so that he could cross into Czechoslovakia, because he was on a death list, because after Hitler had taken power in Germany, gone to interview all his sort of country bumpkin relations around Braunau, which did not amuse Hitler at all, and so he was a marked man.
Anyone? Yes.
I just want to say that I know Julian, and I've known him many years because of our experience together in the Balkans. And when I saw the ad about your book, I almost screamed because, as I told you, I just had converted 2 years ago. And I just want to say, for people to understand.
I feel as though I'm not going to be able to recover all of this, so why don't you just take the mic?
Thank you so much. Okay. I just want. Yeah, I just converted 2 years ago, and I was like, oh well, I have to go first of all, because I hadn't seen him since he wrote his book on the Balkans, chasing the war criminals in the Balkans, and I hosted him for a book talk at Columbia where I teach Balkan studies. And so when I saw this, I thought, no one but you, Julian, would go and investigate your own family and your own life. And I knew that it had to be an incredible book. I haven't had a chance to order it yet, because of who you are and how we know you, with such great humanity, with such great commitment to the craft. And you and I have seen and been in rooms with many war criminals, many, and seen some of the worst of humanity, but as you said, there are good people everywhere, and we have met them in the Balkans. But this story just when I saw the name of the title, I teared up because I know the story because of my own seeking to become a Jew. And so, what a gift. And as the rabbi said, at this moment, so much hatred and nationalism. And as the rabbi also said, you are a part of us now. I could not be more proud of being a Jew now, and your contribution to all of us. I just want to thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Here's your mic.
That's very beautiful. Thank you. Wow. A couple more questions on this side. Yes. So questions about Lisbeth Rudman, and she stayed in touch with the family that fostered her.
I know how important the legacy of what happened for the Zimmerman family is. I'm curious if you were able to speak with any families and their children in England, if they consider this part of their legacy and part of their history.
So
They were kind people, and how that's affected them now, especially what's happening in the world today.
So the importance of the question is about have you spoke to other families in addition, like in the particular story of Elizabeth Ruderman, that it's a part of the family history and that she stayed in touch with the foster family. And did you discover that was also true in the case of others who were fostered as well, that they made it a part of their family's history and their legacy?
Yeah, in some cases. In one case, the host family that had saved one of these children, the descendant was also a journalist and working for the BBC in the Middle East, which was a coincidence. But also, I mean, there is another part of the story, which is many of these families who took in these children treated them abominably. They made them get up early and work and be sort of child labor. It's almost, it's just impossible to imagine doing that. And one case in particular, a girl called Gertrude Batcher, who was taken in by this quite well-to-do family in the provinces in England, and they made her work really hard. But more importantly, they didn't help her save her parents. These children came to Britain at the age of 13, 14, immediately had the burden of trying to get their parents out by trying to persuade people to sponsor them. And this family who'd taken her in did nothing, and her parents died, and she had to live with that legacy the rest of her life, knowing that, always wondering if she tried harder, could she have saved her parents? It was a mixed picture, and my father was very lucky in finding the Bingleys, because there were families out there who just exploited the children that they had saved. It's bizarre.
Thank you, yes.
I wanted to ask, you said that there were 80 ads around, and so I wondered how many were saved of the 80, and how you chose the stories that you wrote.
Yeah. Do you want to repeat that? Or?
How many of the 80 that you had said earlier that there were 80 or so, and so how many of them were saved?
Yeah, almost all, because
Before the kinder transport, so just everybody
yes,
knows, obviously.
So if their parents had it together enough to put in these ads, then they were the kind of parents who, when the kinder transport happened, late November, December 38, they kind of got their kids if they failed to get a reply from the adverts, they were the kind of parents who had the wherewithal and the initiative to get their children out. But they didn't all survive themselves. This is the thing, it was really the optimists who died because they believed it would pass. And it was the more well-to-do, the wealthier, who died because they had more to lose. They couldn't bear to leave what they had built throughout their lives, their businesses, their houses. They couldn't bear to leave them behind until it was too late. And that happened gradually, but they would turn around and it became too late to leave. So though most of the children were saved, perhaps only half of the parents came out alive. Because there were a handful who left behind these full comprehensive accounts, either in memoirs that they'd left just for their family, or had been printed in Dutch, or in the case of Liz Ruderman, she was still alive, or the case of Gertrude Langer, she had given this long interview for this documentary about Shanghai. So there were only a handful that had a full account because all but one had passed away. And it's just a stroke of luck that that handful of accounts were so different.
So we're at time, and it always happens that there's so much more to talk about. And I encourage you, especially if you love Julian already, to not be deterred by Amazon's faulty algorithms. I've heard that Jeff Bezos was playing a little bit with the book, but it's available.
It is available. Yeah, please, try and get it read there, and please be patient. It's gone into reprint, but the reprint will take a while because of the current spat with Canada. Mm-hmm. There's a shortage of paper.
But you can also buy it on Kindle.
You can get it on Kindle, yeah.
You can definitely Kindle it. I'll just say for me, it's a book that will move you. It's a book that will ask you to ask yourself questions about what you remember and what you don't. It's a book, I think, that will push you if you have living access to people whose memories you haven't yet, culled or invited. It's something profound about, for me, in reading the book, but that for you, Julian, someone who's made a living and a name and a career in asking questions, how simple the turn would have been to ask questions, but of course, it's not always that easy, right? And so part of this book is also cautionary and exhortative in wanting us to ask questions and to ask the questions of the people while we can.
Yeah, while they're living.
While they're living.
The granny. Yeah.
Absolutely. Interview them, ask them a simple question, a feeling tone. And I just want to invite people to buy the book. Really, it's an incredibly important read. And I also wanted to just end this incredibly important night. And I feel like I could talk to you for a long time and learn from you and listen. We started with talking about the Yortzeit of Valley's, right, father. And tonight being that Yortzeit, that memorial of his passing. So I wanted to read this prologue that you have, or this quote in the beginning of the book, which comes back to Gertrude Basha, whom you named just now as someone who made it out but couldn't get her parents out because of. She wrote, "I feel as though half of me is fighting the other half by trying to forget rather than remember. And I realize that is probably what I've been doing all my life. That one half of her was fighting the other half by trying to forget." And I think that Julian, I don't know if you think in this way, but as a rabbi, I often talk this way and actually think this way, that your father, Bobby, you did him a great service in your willingness and your courage to go tell his story and to tell the story that he couldn't tell for yourself and for your family in every direction, and also for those who will read it. I think that in our tradition, to tell the story of someone who's passed from this world is to keep them alive. And in that way, I think that this book wins that battle that Gertrude, that Yehudit was speaking to, the battle between one half and the other trying to forget. You actually helped your father's memory become a victory in an unbelievably horrific story. And so I just wanted to thank you and bless you that your book makes its way to everyone who needs to read it, and that people will leave this tonight wanting to go and listen to you tell the story of these incredible people. So thank you, Julian.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.